18th day, upper wind month, 1 CE, 1100 hours. A warm breeze blew across the deck of Livfrodstatir as it plied the waters between Orokalon and Seagate. Under a flowing ensign of the Draconic Kingdom, Sabos stood behind Queen Auricula's shoulder, scanning the surroundings as the Queen conversed with Countess Corlin. He had never journeyed or fought on a ship before, though Cocytus mentioned that combat aboard a marine vessel had major differences from fighting on land. The Sorceress Kingdom's nascent navy was in the process of developing a wide variety of tactics for maritime and amphibious operations, but Sabos hadn't had the opportunity to study them. Countess Corlin had offered a few basic pointers, however. Central to them was the fact that a ship underway was not fixed to anything. If he exerted excessive force in any movements, the ship would react accordingly. For instance, suddenly sprinting with his full might would propel the ship in the opposite direction, possibly sending it flying several dozen kilometers across the countryside. As such, he had to pay extra attention to Queen Auricula's surroundings so he could react well in advance to any incoming threats. "The name of this ship," Queen Auricula said, waving and smiling at her subjects cheering from the shore. "It is not of a language familiar to us." Livfrodstatir is the name of one of the foremost shipwrights at the Frost Giant shipyards along our northern coast, Countess Corlin replied. "All of our transports are named after individuals who were instrumental in the development and construction of these ships. And here we thought these were the product of some great sage residing in the Sorcerer's Kingdom." Not to downplay the achievements of the sages, the Countess Corlin said, but great works of industry are rarely the product of an individual stroke of genius. These ships are a result of a combined effort from both the Sorcerer's Kingdom's citizens and its allies. Rantle has been landlocked until recently, so the Katsa River wasn't of much use to us. Our shipbuilding industry was similarly non-existent. "It sounds like there is some grand tale to tell," the Queen said. "At least to those who are interested in such matters. I would say that it is a tale that highlights the benefits of cooperation, Your Majesty. Back when the Duchy of Rantle was annexed, the change that the Sorcerer's Kingdom would bring to the region became glaringly apparent. I was of the mind that, since the Sorcerer's Kingdom used the undead for various things, the Katsa River system could be turned into a transportation corridor that links the Sorcerer's Kingdom with the southeast. We had to start with very little in the way of shipbuilding knowledge, however. Most of our research was based on what we could find out about water transportation in Riestais, Baharuth, and Slane. Our initial proposals were somewhat embarrassing, but we were encouraged by His Majesty's Royal Court to continue exploring the idea." Queen Auricula nodded. "Any nation with navigable river systems possesses a colossal advantage over one that does not. Incalculably so if those river systems grant access to the sea. They would be fools to not see that. Still," Countess Corlin said, "we're very grateful for their support. In time, as His Majesty's dominion expanded, we found that the talent and artifice we were missing were in the hands of peoples not 200 kilometers away. The passion of the Frost Giant tribes seeking to reclaim their maritime heritage led to the construction of many prototype vessels. The rekindled industries of the Azalizian dwarves transformed those wooden prototypes into constructs of rune-forged steel. Naturally, the motive force is provided by undead from the Sorcerer's Kingdom. The machining is done by workshops under House Wagner, which, as you might have guessed from its name, has been in the business of machining for its entire existence. Everything incorporated into our vessels has existed for as long as anyone can remember, but it is only with the advent of the Sorcerer's Kingdom that we were able to envision everything coming together and render that vision into reality." Sabos nodded silently as Countess Corlin shared with the Queen and her nearby courtiers. With Nazaric's efforts in the areas west of the Sorcerer's Kingdom following a deeply concerning chain of developments, he and several of his colleagues feared that chaos, destruction, suffering and despair would become the primary drivers of the Sorcerer's Kingdom's efforts abroad. He felt that the work of Countess Corlin's delegation was much needed to counterbalance the evil being wrought. The directive of Ainzulgaun to turn the Sorcerer's Kingdom into a nation that stood above all others, one that offered eternal harmony and prosperity to those under the Sorcerer King's rule, was an objective most suited to a supreme sovereign. Unfortunately, how that objective would be achieved was subject to various interpretations by Nazaric's denizens. Some, like Uri Alpha, sought to develop the potential of the Sorcerer's Kingdom's citizens. Pestonia and Sabos, too, made similar efforts in pursuit of the same goal. Those that undertook these quiet, Benevolent activities were in the minority, however. Another set of NPCs, namely Cocytus, Aura, Mayor and Pandora's actor, followed a more or less neutral approach. They performed the tasks assigned to them, helped maintain the security and order of the realm, and had their own projects that they hoped would assist in achieving the goals set for them by Iron Summer. Of the remaining NPCs, Demiurge was, of course, the worst of them all. In a word, he was a menace. His plans nearly always involved sowing destruction and chaos in the places that he targeted, tearing everything apart under the pretense that it was to rebuild a new order under Iron Summer. It was a sick and twisted order, however, for Demiurge measured happiness, harmony and prosperity in sick and twisted terms. To be happy, all one needed to be was less sad than those being inflicted with suffering. Sharing misery was harmony of a sort. An impoverished, disease-ridden village could consider itself prosperous if the rest of its country was reduced to ash. If Ainz-ul-Gaun had not mentioned that he did not wish to rule over a pile of rubble, then Demiurge would have turned the world into a pile of rubble to show how superior the Sorceress Kingdom was, relatively speaking. The greater the difference, the better. Albedo sought to establish the Sorceress Kingdom as the supreme hegemon of the region, and then the world, seeing to its productivity and excellence while arranging for its continued expansion through any means necessary. In Rheastis, she sought to subvert authority through a network of puppets and collaborators. The intervention in the Draconic Kingdom was also an initiative that she had a hand in, though instead of puppets and collaborators, a legitimate effort was being made through officials from the Sorceress Kingdom. Seeing the progress being made in the Draconic Kingdom pleased him, yet, at the same time, it raised questions. Or rather, Sabos could only ask one thing: why? If it took a mere mote of Nazaric's power to bring the Draconic Kingdom onto its side, then why was it necessary to pile evil upon evil to achieve the same result elsewhere? Why did millions have to die in the Abelian Hills and the Holy Kingdom of Roble? Why were they orchestrating the downfall of Rheastis through civil strife? Sabos had seen many unsettling things in Rheastis, but, while some callously believed that the acts of the few represented those of the whole, he in no way agreed that millions of innocents should be put to the sword for the sins of the few. Nazarick had the power to effortlessly punish whoever needed to be punished while saving those who needed to be saved. He couldn't understand why the likes of Demiurge and Albedo thought it necessary to cultivate a legacy of evil, but he couldn't oppose the Supreme One's approval of their heinous acts. He could only be thankful that Shiltia Bloodfallen had been assigned to manage the Sorceress Kingdom's transportation network rather than being unleashed upon the world beside Albedo and Demiurge. Strangely enough, the way that the vampire seemed to seamlessly infiltrate human society and build up achievements through her collection of local vassals ended up accomplishing far more good than all of the Sorceress Kingdom's goodly NPCs combined. If only we had been afforded the same chance, the same authority. No, there must have been some reason why all the good in Nazarick had been purposely withheld from participating in its activities abroad to the same degree. Some unfathomable vision that could only come from the incalculable intellect and wisdom of the Supreme One. The barge slowed as they approached the next of many villages on the way to Seagate, and Sabos renewed his vigilance. A cheer rose from the villagers on the shore. Unlike with the previous villages, however, the ship turned and stopped, extending a metal ramp to the shore. Members of the palace guard disembarked to form a perimeter while a few Death Knights offloaded farming equipment manufactured in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Queen Auriculus and her entourage, which included her entire cabinet, went ashore once the way was cleared. Hundreds of curious villagers had gathered from the nearby area, seemingly divided between being overjoyed to see their sovereign and unsettled by the presence of the undead. The Queen's entourage boarded a set of wagons, which had been prepared by Countess Wagner and brought along for the trip, and rolled off down a rural road to the fields nearby. The Queen eyed the Death Knight pulling the vehicle. We must say that it's strange to see a human-like figure pulling a wagon. Back in the Sorceress Kingdom, Countess Corlin said, it's usually Soul Eaters doing this sort of work. Soul Eaters? Lady Sorriul frowned, as in the legendary undead that destroyed the Silent City in the Beastman Confederation? That's what they say, Countess Wagner shrugged. They stop feeling legendary after you see hundreds of them running around every day. We lease them at a great rate if you're interested. Lady Sorriul sent a reproachful look across the Queen's back at Countess Wagner. Of the Draconic Kingdom's royal court, she was the person most opposed to further advances by Countess Corlin's delegation. Refusing anything from technical assistance to increased aid, the young noblewoman was confident that the people of the Draconic Kingdom could handle their domestic affairs as they always had. Over the past few days, the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation quietly accepted the continued resistance of Queen Draudilin's court. After going back to Irantal to meet with Albedo, however, Countess Wagner was starting to bite back. "No, thank you," Lady Sorrel sniffed. "We can manage just fine on our own." "Is that something you're authorized to say on behalf of the Draconic Kingdom?" Countess Wagner asked. Lady Sorrel bristled and narrowed her eyes at Countess Wagner. Countess Wagner, however, had already turned her attention away to the fields ahead. From his place behind the queen, Sabos' eyes went from one woman to the other. Perhaps Countess Wagner was on the offensive because the delegation was about to go from making claims about the effectiveness of the Sorceress Kingdom's undead labor to demonstrating it in the fields. Their wagons stopped a few hundred meters from the riverbank, where a pair of Death Knights were busy setting up one of the pieces of equipment that they brought with them. One of them fastened the straps of a harness onto the other, which was attached to a wheeled frame mounted with 6 plow blades. Countess Wagner hopped off the wagon to join them. Queen Auriculus stood up on the wagon bed, shading her eyes against the midday sun. "Ah, whose land is this?" Countess Wagner asked. "Oh, ours." A young man who looked about 14 years of age raised his hand. Beside him stood a young woman of about the same age. Countess Wagner gave the couple an appraising look. "New tenant?" "Yes, m'lady. Said they were handing out quarter hides to new couples, so we got married and took them up on the offer." "Well, good on you," Countess Wagner grinned. "It's not often that you get land thrown at you like that." "That's what we figured, m'lady." Like the farmers around Irantal, it appeared that farmers in the Draconic Kingdom did not marry for love. What determined whether one's candidacy for marriage was whether they would inherit a tenancy or become a successful tradesman. Without land to manage or a license and facilities to practice one's trade, one couldn't earn a decent living and thus could not support a family. "So a quarter hide." Countess Wagner looked out at the field, "Just to be sure, one hide is 120 acres around here, right?" The farmer nodded. Countess Wagner signaled the Death Knights, who went on their way. 30 acres, she addressed the crowd. "That's 15 days of work using a team of horses and 2 bottom plow. Am I right?" Dozens of heads nodded in the crowd. "These fellas here," Countess Wagner jerked her thumb over her shoulder, "they'll get those 30 acres done in an hour." "What?" Mazar Forst, Minister of Rural Development, squawked. "Yep," Countess Wagner replied. "What? Indeed. If I went back to myself 2 years ago and told me that, I'd have laughed in my face. But, well, that's how it is now. In the time it takes one household to plow 30 acres, these Death Knights will get 10,000 acres done. That's the work of 333 farming households." The Countess turned her gaze to Queen Auriculus. "One of your Majesty's barons can lease a pair of Death Knights to cover all 5 of their villages. The undead can't do everything, but what they do is still enough to give each household time to work a half hide instead of a quarter. That means your capacity to cultivate grain crops will remain unchanged even if you lost half of your people." A low murmur broke out amongst the spectating villagers at Countess Wagner's claim. "That's double the harvest, so that isn't right. If the mouths to feed stay the same, the double goes to market. Think of what you could do with that money." "Sure, but how much is the lease?" Men and women discussed amongst themselves, throwing out rough speculations over seasonal household harvests and how things might change. The members of Countess Corlin's party appeared to be pleased over the villagers' reaction, but the reaction of Queen Draudilin's court was mixed at best. With the plough demonstration continuing in the background, Countess Wagner showed off the other pieces of farm equipment on display. The villagers seemed to instantly recognize what each one was, and the Countess spent more time answering questions than explaining what her products did. "That last one, there's a mill, right?" one of the villagers asked. "Sure is," Countess Wagner answered. "Just like you can use draft animals to drive a mill, our undead labor can do it too. The Death Knights here are so strong that you can have a more powerful mill. As you can see, this one doesn't use wooden gears, it uses steel ones. We sell all the parts to turn one mill into anything you need. So we can grind flour or cut timber by just swapping out the parts? And more. You can pump water or crush ore. spin a lathe or run a crane. Anything that you use animal labor for, we have machines adapted for our friends out in the field there to use. They don't need fodder and they never get tired. If a beastman pops up, they'll be more than happy to get rid of it for you. Pestana was right. Nazarik's head made always remarked on the adaptability and creativity of this new world's natives. When they first arrived, Sabos' knowledge of production was limited to the Yggdrasil techniques contained in the Great Library of Ashurbanipal. If one wanted to craft an item frame, one used a book from the library. If one wished for a specific type of food or other consumable items, one used specific recipes. There were thousands of recipes available, but the fact of the matter was that they never changed. Conversely, the natives of the New World were in a constant state of change. As weak as they were, their potential was seemingly infinite. New and improved things were produced by their artisans season by season. New spells, abilities, skills and martial arts were constantly under development. Race and job classes unheard of in Yggdrasil were regularly proven to exist, and, if Pandora's actor was correct, entirely new race and job classes could be created. In a way, it was intimidating. For Nazarik's part, Iron Summer sought to monitor development in all fields. This was to both ensure that Nazarik reaped the best of what the Sorceress Kingdom cultivated and to control anything dangerous that might manifest. As promised, the field took roughly an hour to fully plow and Countess Wagner's product demonstration ended. Despite what Sabos thought was a decisive display, the sentiment of the royal court did not change. The villagers were enamored of the idea that much could be gained through the equipment shown to them, but they were also hesitant about employing the undead. Countess Corlin and her party took the disappointing response in stride, packing away their equipment and returning to the barge to continue the journey west down the Orichalon. It was a parade of sorts, with the vessel from the Sorceress Kingdom being escorted by 3 ships from the Draconic Kingdom. They slowed down every 3 or 4 kilometers so that the villagers along the shore could see their queen, who stood and happily waved to her subjects as they lavished their adoration upon her. Between villages, the queen would wander around the ship, speaking to the nobles standing in groups on the main deck. Orban, the queen said as she approached the dark-haired minister of the economy. Your Majesty, Orban and his deputies bowed. What are the ministry's thoughts on the equipment demonstrated by Corlin's delegation? The plows were undeniably impressive in practice, Minister Orban replied. All of the artisans we've spoken with affirm the quality of their craftsmanship. Based on what we've seen, they would certainly assist at the beginning of our recovery efforts. The problem is that there is no need for any of this in the long term. The minister glanced at Sabos before continuing his explanation. Our country has always recovered quickly from beastman raids. One might argue that the magnitude of the current invasion is beyond anything we've experienced before, but our rate of recovery still broadly applies. Your Majesty has seen the crowds at every village. They are full of fresh young faces ready and eager to claim vacant tenancies and build new lives. While not every tenancy may be filled right away, we expect it to be the case within the next few years. Lord Orban, Countess Corlin said, you say this as if a return to the old status quo is a desirable thing. That's right, the minister replied. I don't see why that shouldn't be the case. Should this not instead be seen as an opportunity to retool your economy? The Countess asked. A nation's economy is limited by how it utilizes its labor and resources. The amount of labor you have is limited by food production, which is limited by land. Let's say for now that 3 million people remain alive in the Draconic Kingdom. Your population before the occupation was 7 million. If, with the assistance of undead labor, you can already utilize all of your lands, does that not mean you have essentially freed up 4 million future citizens to work in other sectors of your economy? My lady, it is hardly the time to be experimenting with the economy of our country. Regaining stability is our goal. Playing with our people's lives by embarking on unproven ventures before then would be selfish and irresponsible. All around them, the groups of nobles that had gathered to listen all nodded at Minister Orban's words. The discussion paused when the barge slowed and Queen Auricula's left to wave at the next crowd of villagers gathered on the riverbank. Sabos had no expertise in economics and admittedly less than rudimentary knowledge of nearly all of the topics brought up by the Queen and her nobles. The nobles did not seem to be resisting the Sorceress Kingdom's proposals out of self-interest or any malicious intent, so Sabos thought he could sympathize with them. As an NPC, he was created to serve the supreme beings and protect the sanctity of Nazarik. A noble had many similarities to an area guardian, as they were assigned to manage areas of a country and uphold the order of those who ruled them. But as beings in an ever-changing world, was maintaining the status quo a desirable thing? For many of Nazarik's denizens, the fact that the world constantly changed and evolved would be disturbing if they were as weak as the locals. Thus, ensuring that the denizens of the world stayed in their weak situation was an overarching thought that accompanied the plans of Albedo and Demiurge. "The Sorceress Kingdom brings change, Lord Orban," Countess Corlin said. "You and your people may not find the old status quo to be so desirable once it returns and you have had time to understand what that change entails. By then, it won't be so easy as it is now to make the desired adjustments." "I suppose we shall see about that, Lady Corlin. In the meantime, our lands are bountiful enough that we have no fear of hardship even with our old status quo." Minister Orban offered nothing more, exchanging pleasantries with Queen Auriculus before the next village came into view. The cycle of viewings and discussions continued for 4 more villages, at which point the southern town of Seagate came into view. Dozens of small vessels awaited the Queen's arrival in the estuary. Hundreds of cheers carried over the wind and waves as the barge made its way to the town's largest pier. A pair of nobles stepped out from the crowd of townsfolk, bowing deeply in greeting. "Your Majesty," the one on the right said. "Welcome to Seagate. As you can see, the citizens are overjoyed to see their queen." A renewed wave of cheering drowned out whatever the noble was going to say next. Rather than showing any offense over being interrupted, he merely smiled, sharing in the citizens' sentiment. Sabos focused on their surroundings, eyeing the buildings and rooftops as Queen Auriculus was conveyed through the streets of the coastal town. 4 shadow demons assigned to the escort flickered from alley to alley, but in the journey from the wharf, around the town and to the town hall, no ambushes or signs of unrest were detected. The Queen was led into the administrative officer's main hall, where one of the noblemen stopped Sabos at the entrance. "Please wait outside," he said. "This area has long been secured and we will be discussing the business of the realm." Without waiting for a response, the door was shut in his face. Sabos quietly weighed his options. The area had long been cleared of beastmen by Baroness Saradnik's forces, so it was unlikely that any would appear in the town. Queen Auriculus' subjects were fanatically loyal, so it was similarly unlikely that they would purposely bring any harm to her. There were no powerful individuals amongst her courtiers. After Sabos and the shadow demons, Countess Corlin was the next strongest in the building. As a precaution, he ordered 2 of the shadow demons to guard the queen inside the room. The others were sent to guard the perimeter of the building. With the security arrangements for the meeting seen to, Sabos turned to find Countess Corlin, Countess Wagner and Baroness Gonye standing in the antechamber with him. Countess Wagner wordlessly shrugged and went back outside with Baroness Gonye. "I'm sorry, Lord Tian," Countess Corlin said. "Whatever are you apologizing for, my lady?" Sabos replied. "I feel that this is all my fault." The Countess touched the tips of her fingers in front of her waist. "We've unintentionally cultivated antagonistic sentiment from Queen Auriculus' court and now you're being unjustly subjected to it." To be honest, my expectations were not very high to begin with." The Countess' fingers stopped. "They weren't, my lord. Have I ever told you of my first trip abroad in this region, my lady?" "I don't think so." Sabos moved away from the door to stand across from Countess Corlin, holding his hands behind his back. "His Majesty did not send me on a diplomatic errand, but I ended up in a number of negotiations nonetheless. First, I negotiated the release of an abused young woman for 100 gold coins. That led to accusations of slave trading. To keep a low profile, the official that visited me demanded an additional 500 gold coins." Countess Corlin's amethyst eyes seemed to gleam with an unnatural intensity. The voice that passed her lips was calm and quiet, but if one could kill with words alone, Sabos believed that the young noblewoman before him was capable of it. "Slavery is indeed outlawed in Riastais," she said, "but there is no law or procedure that allows one to destroy legal records or annul any ongoing proceedings." "Oh, they were quite clear about it being an illicit transaction," Sabos replied. "They took the time to gloat openly, even going so far as to suggest that they should be allowed to have solution." "Miss Epsilon?" The young noblewoman's mouth fell open. "I assumed that they weren't aware of what they were asking." "Surely not," Sabos smirked. "At any rate, I was unfamiliar with Riastais or its laws at the time." To avoid causing trouble for His Majesty, I felt it necessary to go along with their farce. That wasn't the end of it, however. One thing led to another and the situation eventually became violent. Compared to that, I would say your efforts in the Draconic Kingdom are going slightly better. Sabos raised a hand, indicating a small distance between his thumb and forefinger. Countess Corlin stared at the space for several seconds. Have things really gotten that bad, my lord? Please have some confidence in your abilities, Lady Corlin. Sabos lowered his hand. Lady Albedo would only accept the best to serve as representatives of the Sorceress Kingdom. You should start a romance subplot between Julian and Ludwig. Florine nearly tripped over her own feet. Julian and Ludwig? Yeah. But you're Julian, and Ludwig is. Leanne's mouth worked like a fish for several seconds before closing again. Her fingers drummed against her thigh. That's not what I was suggesting. Really, I wasn't. Florine didn't see anything wrong with Leanne being attracted to Ludmilla. Ludmilla had many larger-than-life qualities that many would be drawn to. More importantly, she was calm, affectionate, though outsiders wouldn't think it, and reliable. But my intelligence network indicates that Ludwig x Julian and Julian x Ludwig are only about 1% of the fanbase combined. If I wrote a romance subplot for Julian and Ludwig, it would cause all sorts of problems. Dreams of Red has so many fans and there's a non-zero chance that some people might kill themselves over having their preferred pairings invalidated. I don't want to be responsible for that. Is that so? Leanne said. Darn. Leanne turned her attention to the nearby townsfolk. Florine thought she heard her friend click her tongue. Did she really like Ludmilla that much? Since they had been barred from observing the proceedings of Queen Raudilin's court in Seagate's town hall, Florine suggested that they go and observe the proceedings of the townsfolk instead. As the leader of their delegation, Claro stayed behind with Lord Tian just in case the Queen needed her for something. They were still at a loss as to how to proceed with their diplomacy, but, fortunately, they had a schedule that kept them mostly busy. Queen Auricula's was on a planned tour to and from Seagate, one of many such tours she would be taking around the country, and the day's events continually provided them with information and ideas to work with. As the morning went on, Clara remained reserved in her interactions, even with Leanne and Florine. Florine saw all sorts of important things that their previous confinement to the palace and the city had not afforded her before. Leanne, as expected, was starting to get feisty. People don't change so easily, I guess. Even merchants. Florine feared that knowing what was going on would alter her friends' behavior, but it seemed that they couldn't help but be what they were and react accordingly. With their industrial offensive underway, Leanne was determined to bring her industrial revolution to the Draconic Kingdom. If the nobles wouldn't give ground, then she would appeal to other parties. Whoa 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 whoa. Temple of Crazy ahead. Temple of Bounty. No, it's the Temple of Crazy. Let's go around before a priest pops up and tries to turn me into a model broodmare. Leanne turned to walk away. Florine grabbed her by the elbow. Wait, Leanne. That sounds dangerous. We have invisibility items. Her friend sighed. Florine dragged her over to a nearby alley, where they activated their items and stood out of the way of any potential traffic. So, why did we stop? Just watch. The temple was about as large as one might expect of one serving a town, but it was far busier than it should have been. A long line of men and women stretched down the block and around the nearest corner. Aren't there too many people going to that temple? Florine asked. I think so. Leanne answered. What did that big-boobed banshee say again? 11% of the Draconic Kingdom's subjects worship the Six, making it the second largest religion in the country. If she recalled correctly, the faith of the Four was the largest, and even they only made up 13%. Florine took Leanne by the hand. They followed the line of citizens around the corner, then another and another. Okay, this is weird. Why are there hundreds of people lined up at this temple? Did you see any other temples on the way in? Were they like this as well? I doubt it. It's impossible to miss a huge-ass line like this. Florine disabled her invisibility item in another alley and crossed the street, stopping to speak to a young man that looked a year or two younger than she was. Excuse me, what's this line for? It's for the Temple of Bounty, he replied. Is it some sort of holy day? The man gave her a strange look. No, we're just getting married.
All of you?
Yes? I see.
Thank you. Florine returned to the alley.
They're getting married. All of them?
Leanne frowned. Yes. That's a hell of a lot of marriages. What did that guy back at the village say again? The kingdom's handing out a quarter hide to married couples. I guess it makes sense, but it still feels weird. Florine examined the faces in the line.
Everyone looked like they were younger than she was.
I'm staying invisible, Leanne said.
I don't want a guy popping up every 5 minutes proposing that I have a family with him on his shiny new farm. Ever since Leanne's encounter with the priestess of bounty in the capital, they had purposely stayed away from the Temple of Bounty. The resettlement of the lands to the west of Orichalon started a few days after that, so there hadn't been any lines of young men and women waiting to have their partnership officially recognized at the time. The way that the Draconic Kingdom incentivized resettlement and repopulation was something that any noble in the north would, at least in theory, do. It never happened in practice, however, as none of the northern human countries faced the same situation. The closest to it was Ludmilla's campaign to attract tenants to her territory, but a different set of obstacles faced her. In Riestais, there were places that were considered safe from raids, namely the developed interior. Frontier territories had a difficult time attracting migrants. Not only was this because the risks that came with the land were too high, but survival on the frontier usually required skill sets that people from developed lands didn't have. Even with the highly secure state of the Sorceress Kingdom, this perception and the attitudes it fostered were deeply entrenched in local culture. In the Draconic Kingdom, however, a Beastman raid could end up anywhere in the country. Even the capital wasn't safe. The Beastmen saw raiding as both a way to secure resources and a way to definitively prove their personal strength and prowess. They would attack fortifications, go all the way to the coast, and actively seek out strong opponents for prestige. Is this the truth that Ludmilla talks about? Florine half said to herself. Huh?
That thing that she brings up sometimes, Florine said.
You know, where she says that Riestais was sheltered from threats and our society has drifted away from the truth of the world as a result.
I remember her saying something like that, Leanne replied. What about it?
The Draconic Kingdom might have received help from time to time, but nothing shelters them from being constantly raided by their neighbors. When the demon gods ruined the region, it wiped out the cultures and the web of relationships between nations and races that once existed here. In the north, culture developed on a foundation of falsehoods laid by its unearned state of security. If that's the case, the Draconic Kingdom's society is probably correct for a solely human nation. Everything exists because it's necessary.
They still failed.
They did,
Florine admitted.
But the Sorceress Kingdom is here now. What matters is what they will become from this point onwards. To see that, we need to understand what the Draconic Kingdom is now and why. Queen Auriculus already understands all of this and she's been reaching out to shape the future. The more she thought about it, the more awe-inspiring Queen Auriculus was. Within a few days of meeting them, she appeared to have a better idea of what the Sorceress Kingdom wanted from the Draconic Kingdom than the Sorceress Kingdom's delegation. She also understood her country's position and was maneuvering the entire world around them to produce the outcomes that were necessary for her country's healthy future as a member of the Sorceress Kingdom's hegemony. Florine only had the barest sense of what those outcomes would be, but she was certain that they would accomplish the objectives of both nations in ways that she would never have dreamed. Compared to that, the Sorceress Kingdom was very presumptuous in its operations. Everything seemed to run on raw numbers, intelligent solutions and brute force. As Countess Jesn pointed out, the Sorceress Kingdom's diplomacy was not true diplomacy at all. They were simply devising solutions and pushing them into the other party's face without understanding what it was that both sides truly needed. Despite her leading a country that was constantly on the brink of destruction, no one in the Sorceress Kingdom could hold a candle to Queen Auriculus when it came to statecraft in the totality of its aspects.
No, that's wrong, there is one person.
The Sorcerer King, Ainzul Gaun, was guiding the Sorceress Kingdom in the same manner as Queen Auriculus. He had been doing it from the moment of Eranthal's annexation. While Prime Minister Albedo and many other of His Majesty's vassals concerned themselves with matters of bureaucracy, industry and economics as if everything was some sort of giant business, the Sorcerer King focused on the character of the nation. To him, the Sorceress Kingdom was not merely numbers on a page, it was a dream given form. Florine's hand went to the infinite haversack on her left hip,
wherein resided the item Lady Sheltier had granted her. Congratulations, Florine Cadia Dale Gagne. Eternal service awaits. She constantly feared being left behind by her far more capable friends. Yet, His Majesty saw past all of the material things that most tended to focus on. He knew exactly what it was that his country needed and had appointed her to see to the needs that she was adept at addressing. Florine was both humbled by his wisdom and proud that she could be of some use to her sovereign, and she could only hope that she could continue to meet his expectations. Beyond figuring out how to attune the item to herself, however, Florine had no idea how it worked. Maybe that was a test in itself. She worried over the fact that she couldn't seem to deactivate the item, but Liane figured that it was probably supposed to stay active and do what it was supposed to do over time. Hopefully, it wouldn't do it while Florine was walking around on the street. She would be hard-pressed to explain why she had suddenly become a shrub or whatever it was supposed to change her into. The song of hammers on iron and lumber sounded in the air as their wanderings brought them to the southeastern part of Seagate. With so many people running around delivering goods and conducting their business, Liane disabled her invisibility so she wouldn't get run over. They stopped at one of the smithies, watching a man in his mid-20s and a half-dozen apprentices at work. That's strange. I don't see anything strange, Liane said. Not what they're doing, Florine replied. She walked over to the smithy's forge, poking her head into the doorframe. Excuse me, are you the master of this shop? The man looked up from his work. I am, he said. Is there something I can do for you, milady? Are these all new apprentices? Some of them are, the blacksmith said. Most are my juniors. If you have some kids to dump on me, I'm afraid to say that I'm already at my limit with this. I see, Florine nodded. Thank you for your time. Florine went to rejoin Liane. Her friend gave her a funny look. You're so active today. You'd think this is a town of demi-humans with how you're running around talking to everyone. That's because, well, no, that's not the only reason. I'm also trying to learn how things work here. Whenever you say that, Liane said, it's always something that's just way out there. Who is the oldest person that you've seen in this town? Florine asked, aside from Queen Auriculus. Liane scanned the street with a furrow on her brow. Probably the Merchant Guild representative. He looked about in his mid-30s. How many people that old have you seen in the Draconic Kingdom? Her friend fell silent for several seconds. See what I mean? Liane said, you just see things that are way out there. How is that way out there? Florine frowned, it's right in front of our faces. She already knew the answer, but it was still frustrating. Most people didn't actively watch out for that. It was always the relationship or potential relationship one had relative to some other person. They were a vocation first, usually identified through their attire or the establishment that they were in. Very few looked at the big picture, or even a part of it, unless it was important to them in some way. Or until it became a problem. The Draconic Kingdom's demographics, however, were only significant to Liane as a consumer base for the Sorceress Kingdom's exports. Since it was primarily commodities and industrial goods, her target demographics were sorted by industrial sector rather than age. For Clara, they were also part of her political calculations. They were well-meaning calculations that she pursued for the greater good, but they were faceless, impersonal calculations nonetheless. Fine, Liane said. So most of them are young. There's barely anyone in their 30s around unless they're merchants or the people that they manage to safely stash away. That makes sense, though. Even if they're civilians, they still get stronger the more experienced they are. The beastmen go after strong things. The old sacrifice themselves to protect the young. Kids aren't much of a meal, either. Right, but what do you think it means? For us? Or them? Them. They stopped to watch the activity of the town's central plaza from the shadows of another alley. Despite it looking odd to Florine, no one there seemed to act as if the lack of old people was out of the ordinary. Queen Auriculus is like some super granny by comparison, Liane said. A mythological figure, even. That may be true, Florine said, but I was thinking more along the lines of their general behavior and cultural attitudes. This better not be one of those older and wiser deals. It is, Florine replied. At least in part. But which way does that go? Liane asked. Our parents always said that young people are more willing to take risks. They even encouraged us to screw up while you can still afford to or something, but a reckless royal court isn't like that. If anything, they aren't willing to step out of their comfort zone.
It's both, Florian said. We can afford to screw up because we have family and friends to turn to. A home. The people of the Draconic Kingdom can never afford to screw up, so they stick to what they know works. You heard Orban back on the ship, trying to tinker around with economy and industry while amidst their recovery efforts is considered a heedless risk. We know that it isn't, but to them, there's a clear reason behind what they're doing. We're outsiders challenging their collective common sense, so it shouldn't be a surprise that everything we do just bounces off. Leanne leaned her shoulder against a wooden beam nearby, stroking her chin in thought.
How can we use that against them?
Don't you dare.
Why not?
Because we're not here to win, Florian told her. Don't tell me you've just conveniently forgotten the last 2 days of discussion. Or what our ultimate objective is.
I haven't, but they're the ones coming out swinging.
We're an official delegation from the Sorceress Kingdom. You know, representatives of the Sorcerer King. Screwing with us is the same as screwing with our sovereign. If it was Lady Albedo in our place, the Draconic Kingdom would have been turned into a crater 4 days ago. That's probably why we're here instead of her, Florian said.
Besides, they didn't attack first, we did. We're the ones who made all of those proposals without properly considering their position.
Leanne's point, however compelling, was likely an invalid one. It was true that they were representatives of a sovereign and some of Queen Auricula's court approached an unacceptable threshold of conduct. But at the same time, Florian doubted that they would. A major part of the problem was that the Draconic Kingdom's royal court was, in fact, quite capable. While Leanne might throw a fit over their lack of cooperation, none of them showed any signs of incompetence. Each had at least one area of significant expertise and the ministers were all well versed in multiple fields. Salacia Sorul was especially sharp. She quickly discerned the boundaries of their delegation's authority, knew exactly how to stop them at every turn, and who to use to do it. That sharpness was double-edged, however. It could be used to discover the Draconic Kingdom's true boundaries when it came to foreign relations. Florian eyed her friend, who had an ear cocked as she listened to nearby merchants conduct their business. Another part of the problem was, as Countess Jesn had pointed out to them, they were too used to being in control. Upon assuming their places as the heads of their households and adapting to their new circumstances, they all enjoyed an unprecedented level of situational awareness, organization and real authority. Furthermore, their respective ventures were seen as desirable by the royal court and received their full support. The fact that nearly all of their ventures focused on domestic spheres made for a situation where everyone that they worked with more or less cooperated with them. In the Great Forest of Tob, the subservient nature of the demi-humans who were subjugated by the Sorceress Kingdom was so extreme that Florian often had to ensure that everything that she did was, in fact, beneficial and not simply accepted because they thought they would be obliterated if they refused. Their trip to the Empire, though nominally a vacation, was much the same way. Everyone recognized them as officials of the Empire's suzerain and stepped lightly around them. Every request was accommodated and they were allowed to see whatever they wished to see. It took forever to pull Frianne Gushmund into their camp, and even after the fact she remained wary in her dealings with them. In short, their experiences fostered a sense of complacency and blindness. Their one true attempt at diplomacy, Facet County, had failed in a spectacularly terrifying manner, but that was somehow lost on everyone. Now, they were paying for the ease of their past progress with all of the troubles they faced in the Draconic Kingdom. Above all else, Florian felt it unacceptable that they might fail to live up to the expectations placed upon them by His Majesty and the royal court. She certainly wasn't going to let it be their own fault. You should stop directly antagonizing Sorul, Florian said. Why? Because it's pointless. We're already advancing to the next stage. All you need to do is what you planned on doing, and that will infuriate them to no end on its own. At least when they finally notice. I'm sure they'll notice fairly quickly. They're already moving to block us from gaining court intelligence, so they should also have a substantial enough intelligence network to believe that they can counter ours. But we didn't bring one here. Aside from reconnaissance for the Royal Army. They don't know that. Admittedly, it might be fun watching them chase their own tails, but the point is that they're watching what we're doing now. Before, they might have believed the activities of merchants beneath them, But now that their opponents are merchant nobles, they'll be sensitive to what goes on. Ha!
Good luck with that.
Lian's reaction was in no way bravado.
As the situation stood, they would be running circles around the Draconic Kingdom's nobility. Even when it came to the Draconic Kingdom's merchants, the most flattering thing that could be said of them was that they were lean. The vast majority of their trade was domestic, and the domestic markets were not so much bustling hubs of commerce as they were distribution nodes in a land constantly ravaged by beastman predation. Their focus was on ensuring that goods smoothly flowed around the country, because every logistical inefficiency brought the Draconic Kingdom one step closer to annihilation. Upon joining hands with the Sorceress Kingdom, the era that necessitated the Draconic Kingdom's existing domestic paradigms would come to an end. Taxes, laws, infrastructure, security, everything involved would need to be reassessed and reconfigured to fit their new reality. It was Clara, Lian and Florine's task to stir up all the issues that they could see so the Draconic Kingdom's administration could address them. Of course, they had no intention of showing the Draconic Kingdom any mercy on that front, so Florine could already imagine all the screeching coming out of Orichalon. Do you think they'll do anything like detaining our merchants or enacting legislation designed to block our activities? I don't think they do anything out of spite, Florine replied. So far, all of their activities are in service to their country. They might slap tariffs on our stuff, Lian said. The farmers I spoke with at that village were all aiming for food security. That's to be expected. They just came out of a siege. Depending on what they decide on using this season, they may quickly realize that they don't need to use all of their lands for food. The limited land of the Sorceress Kingdom was, for the most part, utilized for food production. Starvation was no longer a threat in their country, but reports of the worsening situation in the Kingdom of Riestais made it inadvisable to switch. No one wanted to be experimenting with new crops when a dramatic increase in the price of existing ones appeared to be imminent. In Lian's eyes, the state of the Draconic Kingdom was an opportunity to raise those experimental crops. Even without druidic magic and undead labor, the Draconic Kingdom could still see excellent returns if they exported raw textiles like cotton and flax to the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Additionally, cottonseed and flaxseed were a source of oil, which was also in high demand. In Lian's eyes, everyone would win from the arrangement, making it especially infuriating when they arbitrarily refused. I don't think they'll be using the undead anytime soon, Lian said. This is gonna be 10 times worse than trying to convince the Empire. The Sorcerer's Kingdom isn't their suzerain and we're letting them run themselves. They're gonna do the bare minimum to stabilize. They'll try to do everything else themselves. And that's perfectly fine, Florine replied. I understand that you two see so many opportunities that could be exploited, but it's simply unnecessary to pursue them right away. It might not be necessary, Lian grumbled, but it's still stupid beyond belief not to. You know that's not true, Florine said. What happened to that spirit of patience you had when we came up with Death Bread? Things are different now. We're bigger and we should be doing bigger things. We are doing bigger things. You just want bigger things to happen immediately. Yeah, no, Lian said, it's no wonder they picked you first. You have, like, an eternity of patience. That was probably as close to a concession as she could get for now. Florine looked across the plaza at the town hall. Clara, how does it look in there? Are they close to being done, or do we have more time? There's no sign either way. Having fun out there? We're seeing a lot of interesting things. Well, I am. Lian's trying to hide from surprise suitors. In a way, their roles were reversed in the Draconic Kingdom. Florine no longer felt the need to stay in the background where she actively tried to avoid the intense gazes and lust-tinged behavior of seemingly every man they came across. Lian no longer worked furiously to attract their attention away from Florine to herself. As a result, Florine found herself more and more taking the lead between them, going to places Lian would rarely frequent and seeing things that she wouldn't usually see. Their shared interest in commerce still tended to always bring them to whatever markets were present, however, and they wandered over to the town's warehouses to watch villagers fill their wagons with grain. I didn't really think about this, Lian said, but that occupation must have screwed with their seed stock. Now that she mentioned it, it did appear that the variety of grain was limited. The vast majority of it was oats, which Florine assumed was part of the grain delivered to the Draconic Kingdom. Do you plan on using that? Florine asked. I sure as hell am, Lian answered.
With all of those nobles screaming over everything else, our distribution plan's been entrenching itself without resistance. They're restoring their fleets faster than expected, too.
I suppose we did figure out how to win in every direction.
Aha. If they don't want the undead, then we'll sell them all of the draft animals we've been trying to get rid of for the last year.
It's their loss and our gain.
Once their merchants get their feet under them again, we'll have them encourage the farmers to grow more lucrative crops. All of their mines in the south are still occupied and they're short on timber, so we can pretty much dominate half of their markets. Once they start using our vehicles and machines, they won't want to go back to the old stuff.
The plan to strengthen the Queen's position really was a lucky move.
I wonder if these systems of theirs are the product of past struggles.
Or maybe it had been set up that way on purpose from the start.
Unlike Rheastais and the Empire, where nobles had chartered urban centers within their territories and continued to rule over them to the present day, the Crown chartered every urban center in the Draconic Kingdom. With over 90% of the Draconic Kingdom's population being rural, this may not have been significant at a glance, but it made nobles in the Draconic Kingdom substantially weaker than those in Rheastais and Baharuth. Urban centers were where the wealth and surplus population of a country ultimately pooled. While peddlers, traveling blacksmiths and village apothecaries existed, the vast majority of commerce and secondary industries solely existed in towns and cities. Towns did not send merchants to villages, villages delivered goods to towns and made purchases from them. Licenses to operate businesses were issued by the Crown. Rent and taxes from advanced industries went straight to the royal treasury. The Draconic Kingdom's royal army never had issues replacing its regular losses.
I dunno, Lian said, but Rheastais would sure look different if they did things this way. The Empire might never have been able to split.
Yeah, no, if it wasn't for the beastmen constantly knocking them down, don't you think that the Draconic Kingdom would have been hella strong?
I think you're right, Florine replied.
And we're eventually going to find out how strong it can be.